Hey, my name's not Bob, but I still like to make stuff, and today we're gonna make this PlayStation arcade cabinet.
The first thing I did was cut out the side panels. This was my first time using a jigsaw, so I tried clamping down some scrap to use as a guide. Ironically, having that in the way made the blade want to move towards it, and it was ruining my entire cut, so I just opted to go without it. I wanted my cabinet to have nice clean angles rather than rounded corners, so to do this, I used a slightly thinner blade to go around the outside of the corner. I came back later to shape it up once the whole thing was cut out. This may be a mundane point to make, but be sure to keep your work area clean. Having sawdust and other particles floating around can be hazardous if it gets in your eyes or is inhaled. Luckily for me, I had supervision from my dog. Once I had one side cut out, rather than tracing it to make a copy, I instead marked where all the corners were and connected the dots with a ruler. You would honestly probably be just fine to trace directly. I just did it this way to try to be more precise, since I designed the cabinet to be made with just two 4x8 foot sheets of MDF, so it didn't leave much room for error. Since I don't own a router, I opted to use a makeshift T-slot cutter that I threw together by stacking a few rotary saws in my Dremel. I had to make several passes before the slot was deep enough for the T-molding, which took a very long time. Almost a whole day of work was dedicated just for the T-slots. Whatever tool you end up using to make the slot, just be sure that the center of the slot is in the center of the panel. Once I had the front, back, and side panels made, I was able to start assembling the cabinet. I made sure to mark the center width of the boards before pre-drilling and ultimately screwing together with wood glue. I also picked up a couple of speed squares for this project, which helped tremendously in getting the corners nice and square and lined up. I dare say this is the most square thing I've ever built by hand. For the top panels, I had to angle the jigsaw for some of the cuts. The way I did this was to put the shoe on the edge of the panel and simply tilt the blade until it lined up with the pre-drawn angles on the board. I know it's not the most precise way for making angled cuts, but granted that the only power tools I own are a jigsaw and a drill, it would have to do. I would later end up going back and filling the gaps with putty anyway, so I wasn't too worried about it. Before I added the top panels, I went ahead and glued on some cleats to help hold them up during assembly. To attach the top panels, I set them in place and pre-drilled some holes before going back and adding wood glue and screws. Here for the control panel, you can see the method I used for pre-drilling the holes in the right places. I first lined up the panel where it would go, and traced around it on both sides. This left a footprint of sorts, so I could see where the middle of the board was. From there, I would drill the holes from the inside of the cabinet, fit the panels back into place, and drill the holes into it using the previous holes I drilled as a guide. From there I took the panel out to drill the holes even deeper, since my countersink drill bits aren't very long compared to the screws that I was using. I ended up hand tightening the screws for most of the panels, since MDF is a softer material and is easily split. If you end up screwing directly into the side of the panels like I did, just be sure to take your time and don't use too much force when tightening the screws. Here you can see a couple of places that still end up splitting a bit, despite my best to avoid it. For the control panel, I glued a couple of blocks to the back corners of the compartment to hold it up, and also glued a couple of blocks near the front of the control panel itself to keep it from sliding off the front. Next, I measured from the edges and marked where I wanted the buttons to be, and pre-drilled the holes at the center points. Then I went back and drilled the holes using a spade bit. To prevent blowout or edge tearing, I drilled halfway on one side, flipped it over, and finished it off from the back. The buttons were pretty straightforward. They just dropped into place and were secured with a ring nut. Again, with keeping your work area clean, I found a surprising amount of sawdust hiding under the cabinet, so definitely check around periodically for any messes. When I got to the speaker board, I wasn't able to put any cleats to support the panel while I pre-drilled the holes, so instead, I drilled the holes through the side panels first, then added the screws. but just enough to have a sharp point poking through. Then I lined up the panel's edge, making sure it was in the right position, and gave the side panels a good few whacks. This made some noticeable punctures in the panels that I could then drill pilot holes into.
So I'm just going to quickly tell how I found the center of where the screen should be on the screen panel. Pretty much what I did is I just drew 2 lines going straight from corner to corner to find the exact center of the board. And then I measured my screen. I have a 19.5-inch screen, which means that all I needed to do was draw a box that was 19.5 inches in either direction. So measuring the center of 19.5, which was 9 3/4 inches. Starting there, drawing lines either side to mark the points, and then drawing the box that would represent where the screen would go.
So it turns out that I made a big mistake with that calculation. See, it would have worked just fine if the ratio of the panel was the same as the monitor, but since they were not, the corners didn't line up with the screen, and I ended up having to make a cutout wider and shorter by cutting more off the edges and adding scrap to the top and bottom. It was a big waste of time in the end, and though I tried to cover it up with putty and eventually paint, it didn't look too great. So please, learn from my mistake and just trace your actual monitor. It's way more simple and accurate. Next was the joysticks. This metal mounting plate turned out to be too big and wouldn't fit with my button layout. To get around this issue, I simply just unscrewed the plate from the joystick and used those screw holes to attach the joysticks directly. Lastly was just a few odds and ends, such as mounting the screen and speakers, as well as those mounting blocks for the marquee light. Next, I took out all the electronics and filled in all the gaps with wood filler before going over the entire cabinet with sanding and cleaning. One of the final steps for the cabinet itself was, of course, the paint. I opted for a matte black instead of glossy in hopes that any fingerprints or scratch marks that might happen over time would be a bit less noticeable. Finally, it was time for the T-molding. I just used some hot glue to keep it in place since my makeshift slot cutter ended up being just a bit too wide. To get the T-molding around corners, you'll just need to notch out a little triangle from the spine to be able to collapse it down. In order to run power to everything in the cabinet, I cut the plug off this power strip and crimped on some connectors that would allow me to attach it to this power cord receptor. To punch out a hole for the receptor, I started by eyeballing the corners and drilling some tiny starter holes before realizing that all I really needed to do was make a slit big enough for the jigsaw blade. Then it was just a matter of cutting away until the receptor fit snugly. Once it was screwed into place, I connected the power strip, plugged everything in, and gave it a quick test drive. It works! I was able to play a quick game of Tetris to make sure all the buttons and speakers and everything was working. Next was to apply the vinyl graphics. It's pretty straightforward, just take your time to line it up and follow any instructions that may come with the print. I did a similar process for the marquee, sandwiching the vinyl between 2 sheets of plexiglass. I also added a sheet of plexiglass to the control panel to make it look a bit nicer and also to protect the artwork. After that, My homemade arcade cabinet is finished.
So there you have it. This thing took me probably close to a year to make, mostly because of waiting on parts to get here and finding time to put it all together and all this stuff. Just working on this in my free time and around what budget I could afford for the time being. Obviously, if I were to do this again, I would definitely trade this out for a bigger monitor. Spend a little bit more time and money on stuff like the graphics, for example. The vinyl's great and everything, but while applying it, I did accidentally create some scratches and some other parts there. But for the most part, for this being the very first arcade machine I've ever built, I feel like it turned out pretty good. This thing probably ran me about $300 to $400, if I remember correctly. Actually, the most expensive part about this was the electronics. The cabinet itself was fairly cheap in comparison. It only cost about $60 of the entire thing. So get creative with it if you decide to make something like this of your own. There are so many different ways you can do it. You don't even have to have a full cabinet. I've seen people make some that they have just like a screen and control panel and then hang that on the wall. A 4-person arcade cabinet that go all out and have a giant 4K TV and a lot of different controls. And honestly, it just depends on what you want and what you're willing to put into. But I'd say for my first attempt, this thing turned out pretty good. This video took me about a year to make, so I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.